we have spent the last 2 years helping to rewire the way that higher education thinks about contemporary anti-Semitism and responds to it.
Data, but I'm sure there's an equally large percentage of Jews who are very conservative, very Republican, and just see Hillel, whether they're right or wrong, as a liberal, progressive / Democrat institution and sort of won't step in because of that. Again, welcome to another installment of the podcast. If my background looks much more forlorn than usual, it is because we are currently in the middle of moving to a larger place, still within Irvine, so don't worry for all of my local Irvine friends. But for the next couple of podcasts, the background will become increasingly bare and austere, so I hope you bear with me there. Today, I have the honor of talking to Adam Lehman, the CEO of Hillel International. For those who know, for the last 100 years, Hillel has really been at the forefront of confronting, I think, all of the biggest questions that the Jewish world is asking today. How do we raise a next generation of well-educated, committed, compassionate, and involved Jews? How do we deal with the rise of anti-Semitism, specifically as proliferating from campus in the last couple of years, but even, as I've argued on other podcasts before, we can stretch that back to 30, 40, 50 years. How do we deal with an American Jewish community that is becoming increasingly diverse in terms of not just Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardic relationships, but also political dispositions, where now the rise of young Jews who are both on the far left and the far right is probably much greater than at any previous recent point in American Jewish history. We get into any and all of these questions, and I really appreciated all of Adam's time. I asked him about how Hillel has changed in the post-October 7th world. We talked about how Hillel accommodates students that are both to the left and to the right of the Overton window that Hillel usually tries to set up. We talk about all of the tensions inherent in pluralism. I ask his opinion about whether or not the golden age of American Judaism is over, and we get into much, much more. And now I bring you Adam Lehman. So I want to eventually talk about a lot of big picture Hillel issues and get your opinion on a lot of those questions. But just because we're recording now early July and it's a couple of weeks after the sort of incredible or fiasco Birthright situation where I know thousands of students, including some of my own students, were in Israel and ended up having to be, I don't know if you would use these terms, but really snuck out on a boat to Cyprus and then flying out through other European cities. I wanted to just sort of get your reflection on that. I mean, was that as hectic as it seemed like for me, sitting here in Orange County to figure out?
It was even more crazy, as you might imagine. I'm sure we'll talk about so many of the twists and turns of the last few years, which have confronted all of us with unique challenges and unique opportunities to step up and show leadership. I did not have on my Hillel bingo card evacuating thousands of students and staff from Israel, and not just in the context of issues, but in the context of a full-on war with ballistic missiles inbound into areas where many of them were actually staying.
Yeah, and I wouldn't usually, push here, but I was just so interested in, because my wife and I just had a baby about 5 months ago. Otherwise, I was about a week away from potentially having also been on that boat. I mean, the decision to actually, I don't know if this was you or somebody from, high up in Israeli intelligence, or maybe, you can't even tell me, but even as, obviously if you're on a boat, it's probably not the safest place to be if, projectiles are flying there. And so even the decision to say, okay, we're not going to tell people to just shelter in place for another few weeks. We're going to actually amass everybody, gather them together and get them on something that's very indefensible, a boat. I mean, who makes, what sort of is the chain of command on those decisions? And I'm going to cut this and, next time parents call me with birthright questions, I'll, here's Adam's answer.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one thing I will say, number one, for Hillel and really for the entire enterprise of Taglit, of Birthright Israel, this is meant to be an educational experience. It is meant to be an experience to help strengthen Jewish identity by connecting young Jews to a critical place in the Jewish story. So I think you have to start with what Birthright is. You then move to the fact that this experience has actually developed over 2 decades now, more than 2 decades, where there is fortunately an incredible amount of sophistication in the logistics associated. Now, that's not so much about how do you move people from the hotel to, buy their talit, underneath in the Jewish quarter. It's about how do you actually have a safe and fulfilling experience in an environment where, even if it hasn't been full on war, there's of course been risk and conflict. So in this instance, we had the benefit as a partner of Birthright Israel of their significant sophistication in terms of safety and logistics. That includes their being in direct contact with government and military officials. So you, in that sense, do actually have as specific and credible an approach as possible when it comes to mitigating and managing risk. So going into it, that was the benefit for us and frankly every other trip partner for Birthright Israel. That said, I think this whole experience was so reflective of not only the startup nation culture of Israel, but also of the agility of Hillel. I know we'll talk more about Hillel, but I like to say we're a 101-year-old startup because we are constantly adapting, inventing, reinventing. And in this case, we brainstormed with our partners at Taglit, with others who were involved in the trip process, first and foremost, just to make sure we could get students and staff to as safe a set of locations as possible. And then to think through what would it take to get everyone out of Israel. And, in hindsight, for sure, we could say the safest approach may have been just sheltering in place, but no one knew at the time whether this was going to be 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 years. And understandably, for not only the students and staff, but their family members and all of us, people were concerned. So just to cut the very long story a little bit shorter, we looked at flight opportunities exiting through Jordan. There was a very limited window for that. We looked at flight opportunities leaving from Ben Gurion, Tel Aviv. That was simply not an option because of safety risk and the fact that Ben Gurion was an active target. We looked at Egypt, even more limited capacity in terms of getting folks out. So then the boat idea came up. And for anyone listening who's not familiar, we ended up chartering 2 cruise ships that took 2,000 students and staff from Ashdod, from the coast of Israel, to Cyprus. And then we figured out with Taglit how to route all of those students back to their home cities. Final point on this, at a safety level, we did have assurances from the government of Israel that there would be protections in place to the extent that those were viable. And thank God, there were no reports of issues aside from a little bit of seasickness and a little bit of sunburn, because just to spin this tale, sorry, I said I was going to be shorter, but a little longer. Even with the adaptability and sophistication of what we were all able to put in place, there were, of course, hitches. So when the first boat arrived in Cyprus, there were supposed to be chartered planes to take them back to the US. No planes. And so we actually had many folks sitting at a hot outdoor airport spot while we then rebooked them all through Rome to Europe.
No, that's really incredible. No, I'm only digging because I can imagine, I mean, if this happened 50 years ago, it would be one of those anecdotes that I'd be teaching about in every class and be like, oh my God. And so, I'm sure in 50 years from now, I'm going to be telling people, hopefully I'll still be, teaching in some capacity then, there was this crazy situation and they chartered a boat. It also helps that, I say this, half jokingly, but, in some sense it's serious. One of my first engagements with Israel was through Leon Uris's Exodus book. And so, there is an uncanny parallel of this being almost the reverse of that. That was a case, obviously, of a boat going from Europe to Cyprus, then eventually to British Mandate Palestine. And also, I remember in 2014, I was an advisor on a Israel and NCSY summer program, and this was very much marketed as, a more upscale, bougie program. A lot of people from, New York area, and within 2 weeks of getting there, it was supposed to be 6 weeks. We were staying at this, really lavish place near Jerusalem. That was when, obviously 2014 was, an earlier iteration of a war with Hamas. and there were rockets falling on the Jerusalem area. And so we were forced to move the entire program, up north. And we ended up sharing a high school dorm with about 6 other camps. And so, rather than everybody have their own room, there were people stuffed into rooms, people were sleeping in sleeping bags. And, this is very much, I'm very big into, Daniel Kahneman's distinction of, the active self and remembering self. And so, in the moment, a lot of us, and, especially the campers who I was in charge of sort of, helping mentor, were like, oh my God, this is terrible. We were supposed to, play sports and, go on all these trips. And now we're basically hunkered down in the north here, doing whatever. But now, still in touch with many of the students now, 12 years later, people look back and say, that was actually the moment where I decided that I wanted to make Aliyah, or that I wanted to do X, Y, and Z with my life. And so I'm hoping, in 10 years, we'll have many parallel stories from a lot of people that just came back. And I know, just talking to a couple students in my mind, that is very much the case. Let's go back, about 2 years, because I know, obviously, almost every conversation that we can have about Jews and campus in some way is going to revolve around October 7th, or really I've almost started thinking about it as October 8th, because, and listeners of this podcast don't need me to go into the sort of, yes, October 7th was a shock in terms of, military and politics, but the October 8th, backlash on campus was a shock in all the ways that I've spent, 20 episodes talking about. But if you're here, hindsight, bird's eye view, obviously overseeing, really hundreds, if not thousands of different campuses, what are sort of, what's your elevator pitch if somebody were to ask you, how did Hillel changed both, quantitatively and qualitatively from, October 6th to October 8th?
Yeah, you cannot overstate the extent of disruption at every level of who we were and what we were required to do. As you alluded to, we saw, in a way that shocked me, sounds like shocked you, and certainly was so destabilizing for so many Jewish students on campus, before Israel had even responded to the atrocities of 10/7, the uprising on campus of anti-Israel forces, using opportunistically that moment to really try to go for the jugular of, taking a big step towards destroying this evil enterprise they view as Israel, and with it, really being completely indifferent or even affirmatively aggressive to Jewish students, frankly, regardless of how they connected to Israel or did not. With that as the pivot or the shift in that moment, campus professionals like yourself, Daniel, and 1,200 of our colleagues had to immediately put on a wave of new hats. Number one, we had to step up in terms of just helping students navigate this inexplicable shift and situation that would, of course, continue really to this point. And that was everything from the normal ways that we try to be there for students to pastoral support that you could speak to better than I, on to mental health support for students, staff who had lost family members, lost friends, had direct connections to people who had been slaughtered on October 7th. So that became part of the immediate shift. A secondary shift was to do everything we could to begin protecting Jewish students on campus in those communities, working with university administrators. Now, again, there's a longer narrative to how that has played out, and I'm happy to go into more detail later. Suffice it to say, in this summary view, that we have spent the last 2 years helping to rewire the way that higher education thinks about contemporary anti-Semitism and responds to it, and hopefully in a way that will lead to healthier, more inclusive campuses, not only for Jewish students, but for all students. We had to quickly turn into a very different kind of organization when it came to the role of government. So immediately following 10/7, as these issues rapidly multiplied on campus and hit a peak point in the spring with the wave of encampments, we were suddenly the voice of Jewish students on Capitol Hill, for the White House, for state legislatures, to try to help not only interpret, but make sure that we were advocating appropriately for the benefit of Jewish students. I'll just hit a few more because there's so many facets, as you know, to what all of us were doing across the movement. Um, we also had to educate. We created a Hillel teaching tour to bring a diverse set of policy analysts and educators to more than 100 campuses. Because again, with this shift and dramatic rise in propaganda and demonization of Israel, not, again, we're an educational institution. We understand criticism, we understand, very aggressive and diverse perspectives. But when it turns into not only politicized, but really almost existentially oriented hate, we felt we needed to rebalance the conversation. So bringing, great policy analysts and educators who could speak to what was happening in Gaza, in Israel, in the Middle East, we found to be a really important role for us to play. And then finally, the other thing I'd lift up is just the core work of Hillel. And this does translate to the numbers. Jewish students needed spaces to go to feel completely comfortable expressing themselves Jewishly and otherwise, and to actually just tap into Jewish joy in a way that would rebalance who they were on campus. Because while there were those who wanted to step up and debate and fight and lead in those ways, there were so many other students who just needed spaces to decompress and experience relationships, community, and all the positive things that we do at the core of our work.
Have you noticed a difference in the type of person who's applying to work at Hillel, right? So, 2 years ago, if, especially for your average, engagement right out of college, the job is, a mix of event planning, social, lots of free coffee that, is incredible. Obviously the Jewish and Israel component are there, but especially if you're primarily engagement, you don't really have to deal with Israel, any more than, okay, sort of lurking in the background. Obviously nobody applying for Hillel in the last 2 years thought, well, I'm just going to bifurcate Israel to the side. And so, how has, just from, again, the bird's eye view, have you noticed that, oh my God, the people that are applying to be executive directors or whatever in the last couple of years, they are a lot more, activisty, bent, or a lot more Israel centric, or, how has that affected the hiring?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we are actually, even though we're not the largest nonprofit or enterprise in the world, within the Jewish space, we're actually a relatively large enterprise, and we do a lot of hiring. So we're a decent weather vane or proxy in terms of the talent pipeline. First thing I want to say about the talent pipeline that speaks to just how incredible so many of our colleagues are across our movement. I anticipated, much like we saw during the pandemic, that after an initial period of professionals really working around the clock to try to be there for students, be there for their communities, that we would then see people tap out of exhaustion, out of burnout, out of just looking for a career opportunity that was less intense. And that was a uniform dynamic across so many nonprofits, in fact, across the entire US workforce for the most part during the pandemic. I expected we might see the same thing here, that after 10/7, and particularly after the entirety of that academic year, we would just see a lot of professionals throw their hands up and say, I love building Jewish identity. I love supporting Jewish community. I love being a part of a higher education community, but I didn't come here to fight, and I didn't come here to be in these really intense conditions. We didn't see that. Actually, our retention rates, looking across the entire Hillel movement last year and this year, have been almost as high as ever. This past year, this past academic year, we had a higher than 90% retention rate, which in this kind of work is quite high. And
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, sorry to cut you off, I think a lot of
please.
people, start to see the value. I remember a phone call, I have a friend who's, relatively high up in the finance world. And I remember a year ago, November, so, about a month and a half after October 7th, he called me and basically said, wow, I'm so jealous, that you are able to do, I spend my day refreshing Israeli news and, wondering how I can help, and you're actually able to do it in some, again, I don't, think it's any major way, but obviously it adds up on all the different campuses with all the different students. And so I think in a lot of ways, the meaning of the work, not that this wasn't meaningful 2 years ago. I mean, I would have, defended it, equally meaningful 2 years ago. But I think it grew and evolved into a heightened purpose. I think definitely over the last couple of years. There was, I won't make you respond to this next comment unless you want to. But one of the things that was always, a little bit bugged me immediately after, in terms of the internal Hillel communication post October 7th was a lot of people saying things like, I know nobody signed up for this, or I know this wasn't in the job description. And I remember, I think I actually recorded a podcast about this where I kind of flippantly said, if you come into this work with an understanding of Jewish history and the last 2,000 years of Judaism, you have to put on your, projection, cause some major anti-Semitic flare-up. Not that, of course, I think it's going to happen or want it to happen, but, I always bring in the, my great-grandfather, started his life as a rabbi in, Eastern Europe, and then all of a sudden the government changes, and now teaching Torah is illegal, and he continues to do it and gets thrown in Siberia for a couple years. I mean, so you kind of live in the shadows of those types of stories, and then you kind of expect, again, we all sort of had our, idealistic or maybe delusions. I'm going to ask you which one you think in a minute about America and America's safety for Jews or lack thereof. But October 7th, in a lot of ways, it kind of threw Jews back into history. And I think this is how many, sociologists defined it, where for the last between 40 and 70 years, Jews in America have been on sort of a vacation from Jewish history. And all of a sudden, we're back in Jewish history, albeit with, an Israeli state, which is crucial, and great Jewish institutions like Hillel, which are crucial. But to me, I've always had sort of more controversial takes on, the lack of a work-life balance when you're in the Jewish world, and sort of, there can't really be any such thing if you really live your work and your mission. But that was, a switch. And I'm glad to hear that it seems like at least the people that have stayed and the people that are joining are sort of coming in with more of that. Okay, at the end of the day, it is quote unquote a job, right? We make money, we have vacation days and sick days and parental leave, right? That stuff's very important. But at the end of the day, when a student texts me at 11:30 p.m. on a Saturday night because something crazy just happened on campus, this isn't, well, I'll answer on Monday morning at 9 a.m. type thing. And I think that really is what separates this work, and really why I love it compared to, again, my friend who, was an accountant and everything there.
All right, so awesome. And definitely always interrupt as we go through here. Three points that we'll build back to actually the original question you asked. Point one, so my great-great-grandfather was a rabbi in Eastern Europe who got chased out. He got chased west, not east of Siberia. But, I come from that same historical perspective in terms of what it means to be Jewish in the world over time. And so to your point, I think that perspective is really helpful in understanding this period. Number two, when we look at our colleagues, how they talked about this period and how they approached it, as you said, there was a lot of, machloket, there was disagreement and back and forth, but there was a strong strain of, no, we absolutely signed up for this. In fact, Michael Simon, the longtime executive director at Northwestern Hillel, wrote a piece specifically on that theme about a year ago. Now, getting to who's applying now, we are seeing, we have a tagline, all kinds of Jewish. We are seeing all kinds of applicants, I would say. We're definitely seeing applicants who literally will use the term 10-8 Jew. I'm a 10-8 Jew. Like, I didn't feel that connected before this. Professionally, I certainly had never thought about working in the Jewish world. After 10-7, I decided it's my calling. I have to do this. Now, I will tell you, speaking of contrarian, I wouldn't exclude a candidate who comes with that mindset, but I would have questions around the longevity of their motivation and the breadth of how they can actually execute effectively as a Hillel professional. Again, for anyone listening, if you feel that describes you, I absolutely still want you to apply for Hillel roles. And I think great opportunity for you to think about how can you continue to grow and broaden what it means to be Jewish, not only in the sense of the fight, but in the sense of also part of the long haul of Jewish history, which is a history of, mystical beauty, magic, soul saving, and everything that goes along with having a thousands-year-old tradition like what we have. We also have had applicants who are actually more responding to certainly nothing related to Israel, but not even necessarily to anti-Semitism, qua anti-Semitism, meaning, we want to come and we want to fight to prevent, any kind of discrimination, harassment, worst case assault, and the like. But they are responding to the need to fix what they see as broken on campus, and they see appropriately Hillel as a critical platform for doing that. And then, fortunately, I think we are also still seeing applicants, whether they are rabbis, educators, student engagement seeking, mental health and wellness professionals, operations professionals, development professionals, a lot of folks coming to the work for the same reason they would have come 10 years ago or even 50 years ago. They want to make a positive difference in the Jewish world and the broader world. And they know that over the long haul, whatever the issues may or may not be, Hill's a great place to do that.
I think also there is a sense, and this is sort of an argument that I've made before, and I'll continue making it, and which is the best way, at least internally in the Jewish community, to fight against, so many people are worried about, Jews becoming anti-Zionist, or, how do we fight anti-Semitism? And, while I do have great respect for people doing this work that I'm about to lay out, another, pamphlet or PowerPoint on here is exactly what anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism is, and here to combat it, I don't think really works. I sort of flippantly say whenever I'm, speaking at shows or talking to donors, and they ask, how do we make sure that the next generation of Jewish high schoolers or middle schoolers or college students, are pro-Israel and, pro-Jewish and all these things. And I sort of say, invite them to Shabbat dinner, study some Mishnah with them, tell them about Moses, Maimonides. And it seems, kind of strange, because why does learning about, Maimonides, a Jew in, Spain and then subsequently Egypt, what does it have to do with, Israel? But in my mind, these things are all a very tightly, interconnected web of things. And I think if we isolate Israel and, say, well, there's many facets of a Jewish life that includes this box, this box, this box, and this box, that allows somebody to say, okay, well, I'll have, A, B, and C, versus I think, a much more fluid type of Jewish definition where, eventually you study enough, Talmud, which is something I've recently started doing with students, and you just begin to realize, like, wow, these rabbis sure mention Israel a lot, even though they're living in, Pumbedita, the middle of modern day Iraq. They seem really interested in this, land, and you study the Parsha every week, and it seems like the Israelites, depending on, which Parsha, seem really intent on getting to this, piece of land. And then when they, meet an argument on campus saying, well, Jews have no authentic connection to this place, they're not, racking their email for, oh, shoot, I remember there was a great PDF somebody emailed me. They just, you almost say, I'm so sorry, I just have no clue what you're talking about. I mean, our texts have spent hundreds of thousands of pages talking about this and everything there. And so, I think also the push for, a more robust Jewish education, I think, is also, pivotal. Obviously, I think that there is, sort of this question of timing, and sort of the next question that I wanted to ask you. And I know, at different Hillel conferences, people have, discussed and debated this, but is there sort of an ideal set of things that a student comes out of? Let's pick your average student, very involved in Hillel, went on Birthright with Hillel, has been on Hillel board for 2 years, goes to, 70% of the Shabbat dinners. Do they want to come out with any particular thing? Is it sort of a general commitment to Judaism? And then I'll sort of ask the question that I think is related. And I know I'm firing a lot of questions at you, but, you can feel free if you want to answer both or just pick one. I've often felt a little bit underwhelmed with conversations of Hillel pluralism, and I promise this connects in a second, because oftentimes I feel like there's sort of two ways to front pluralism. It can either be a premise or a conclusion. And what I mean by a premise, meaning if somebody asks me, hey, Rabbi, how do I'm, going on a Passover program and my family's going to be by itself and they ask me to run the Seder. If I say, well, there's no one right way to run a Seder, here's 40 options, really they're all equal, that might even be what I believe philosophically, but that's a terrible pedagogical thing to say because the student is clearly coming to me because they want some framework or direction. If I say, okay, let's study the very traditional, and for anybody who's not Orthodox, probably parts of it are unpalatable, traditional Haggadah, and then we can kind of discuss each component. At the end, that's still pluralism, but it's pluralism starting off with some substance as opposed to what I often see, not just in Hillel, but in sort of the wider pluralistic or liberal Jewish community, which is very much well, there's no one right way to do anything, which oftentimes leaves students a little bit lost. And they say, well, I came here for some qualitative content. If I'm just told, well, anything goes and everything is great and, I'm incredible and there's no such thing as a bad Jew. Again, all things that I might even, deep down philosophically believe. I think there is that disconnect if we front it there, which again, I think can oftentimes, even if it seems more accepting, it can oftentimes push students away because students might conclude by saying, oh, okay, well, I want to do real Shabbat, whatever that means, not the, oh, whatever you want is Shabbat. So I would love to get your thoughts on sort of that mishmash of questions.
Yeah, wow, that's quite a riff. But a really important one because it speaks to what I think of as a business model challenge or even operating challenge. Let's start with, again, for anyone listening, the Hillel 101 on this, which is when Rabbi Frankel created Hillel at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in 1923, he very specifically said, this is meant to be inclusive. We've got Jewish students coming to UIUC who are from different backgrounds, and I just want to advance them on their Jewish journeys effectively. That's kind of a late 20th century concept of the Jewish journey and advancing them. But I mean, without using those exact words, that is what he intended. And in a really powerful way, Hillel grew over decades to where we now are present on 850 campuses, in 16 countries around the world. And with that same formulation that says we are not denominated, and that's really where this began, more from the, well, it's not Orthodox, it's not conservative, it's not Reform, it's not Reconstructionist. As denominational life began to weaken and even break down in some respects, this notion got even broader. And that actually, the notion of radical inclusivity started to cross map with other social theories that were looking at more kind of creating your own identity. It's like the Burger King, have it your way generation for those who are, remember from the commercials of the 1980s, your older listeners like me. And that in turn, Daniel, I think has led to what you've described, which is in its both kind of ideologically most consistent form and operationally most undoable form, pluralism writ large is everything's okay, anything's okay, and we will just self-define what's Jewish and what's not. Conceptually, maybe that's somehow appealing, but again, in terms of people like you, me, and our colleagues trying to deliver compelling, inspiring, connecting experiences, how the hell do you do it, right? So I think what we have intuitively moved toward and what I hope we continue to strengthen is a pluralism defined by thick, meaningful, content-rich experiences, whether they're spiritual, whether they're educational, whether they're community building, that have the capacity to draw from equally thick, traditions and practices. So more specifically, that means, again, at our most fulsome extreme, that means like if it is take the most basic Shabbat service on a Friday night, that's like so Hillel, that you walk in. I'm in New York today, actually for the funeral of a terrific Hillel leader, Tom Blumberg, Zichrono Livracha, And right down the road is Columbia Barnard Hillel, where during the academic year, notwithstanding all of the issues we could talk about on campus at Columbia and Barnard, they have a really thriving minyan that's egalitarian conservative, one that's modern Orthodox, one that is, camp style reform, one that is, an amalgam of other practices that people have brought together, but they're all rich, thriving, well-defined. Um, where we struggle, and this is part of what you named, take that same Friday night analogy. If you go to a Hillel that actually doesn't have three rabbis, and most of our Hillels do not, or three people who can help organize and support that kind of rich experience, now you walk in, and even if there are multiple minyanim, they're anemic because you can barely, they're truly not minyanim because you can't get a minyan. Or you're just trying to mishmash together the 12 people who show up for the service as compared to the 100 who show up for dinner. So I give that long answer, not as a full-on explanation of what is working, but as I think an articulation of where we need to keep heading, which is to make sure at every Hillel, there are those really, as I said, thick, meaningful experiences where we're not putting on students the work of trying to construct what Judaism should be.
No, I think that's great. And I think, it does speak to just the inherent challenges in something like pluralism or liberalism, just definitionally. It's why, you are, I oftentimes break it, when I teach academically, which I also get to do, I try to put on my full descriptive hat. So I want to describe things as best as possible and give no normativity. So I will say, this is position A, here's what it is. I hope you all understand it. I'll give my best analysis of it. And I'm not going to say this is good or bad. One can imagine going to the other extreme if I came in with a very specific denominational hat as a Reform or Orthodox rabbi. That would be all normativity, right? Here is, the thing, and here is exactly what you should do. Hillel sort of exists in this liminal position between it, where, I think is where it gets so difficult, because it's not just that I'm describing different things. I also, there is a little bit of normativity, right? In my Jewish studies class, I'm not hoping that, every student there ends up celebrating Shabbat for the rest of their life. I'm hoping they're interested in the material academically, but at Hillel, I really am interested that, you freshmen, by the time you're done, you are going to celebrate Shabbat. Obviously, I can be a little bit pluralistic on what that looks like, but in order for you to actually come out with something, there has to be a little bit of normativity that I would not apply in sort of other realms. And I think, this, I think speaks to the difficulty, and, something that I wrestle with a lot as well. Obviously, our main co-organization on campus, one can use whatever adjective, Chabad is very normative in a way that I think is actually very attractive to students. I think a lot of students, even if they disagree with the philosophy of Chabad, and we don't even need to make this a campus question. One of the big stories, I think, of suburban Jewish life or even city Jewish life over the last 20 or 30 years is the number of Reform or conservative synagogues that are dwindling in membership and Chabads that are popping up and increasing in membership is really stunning. And, I'm sure there hasn't really been a lot of academic studies, but I'm sure in 20 or 30 years, that's going to be sort of the big pivot. And again, I sort of wrestle with it because philosophically, there's a whole host of things that I might, disagree with, but in terms of, the normativity that it gives the average person, I think there is a lot of people that in a world that's so full of choice, right? I think, choice maybe 200 years ago would have been, really great because, we were in a world without a lot of choice, but now it's almost like, that famous psychology experiment where if there's 15 toothpastes on the, in Target, you're less happy with your toothpaste option. If somebody just handed you, here, Adam, I know you're going on a trip, here's toothpaste, you'll be, you won't even think twice. And so I do think that some of that plays in also. Of course, it makes it harder on the other side. I can just have this debate by myself. There are a lot of social issues and philosophic issues that, we're not going to just say, okay, let's just see what it says in the Shulchan Aruch, written 400 years ago. And so, this is a really difficult task that I think is a uniquely difficult task for a pluralistic or non-denominational organization.
Absolutely. Amen. And if we look at the positive side of this, even during a period when, as you say, it's beyond question that there's been a movement away from many non-Orthodox movements, when it comes to synagogue membership, synagogue attendance, or other connections to those movements. At Hillel, we've actually grown. We are setting records year after year in terms of total students who are engaged in Hillel experiences. We're up to close to 190,000 students individually who participated in Hillel programs this past year. And that's an undercount because we literally are only reflecting where a student was recorded in our godforsaken counting systems and our Salesforce-based applications for understanding student engagement, where they're engaging, how they're engaging, which makes us a lot smarter. But the point is, there are absolutely students who fly under the radar and don't make it, into those annals, of Hillel. So we're growing in meaningful ways, and we're growing in content-rich and substantive ways. I look at our Jewish Learning Fellowship. It's, I think, a fantastic example of where educationally we are able to be very inclusive in terms of the sources we bring into it, in terms of the topics that we hit: love, sex, relationships, career, wellness. You pick your frame, we can bring Torah, Talmud, and other sources to it. But we don't simply throw to students, 50 volumes of historical Jewish content and say, make sense of it. And we don't, as a Hillel movement, say, okay, at Orange County Hillel, just figure it out. We actually come up with a framework that has been socialized across our professional movement so that we have the insight and input to know what will feel most meaningful for our educators to get out and teach and support. But then we come up with curricula that is common. And I've even thought about, from at a liturgical level, should we lead the way in pluralistic Judaism to come up with more of a defined Hillel set of liturgy and ritual content? There are lots of reasons why not, including we don't want to be in competition with all of the other or all of the religious movements. But the point is, I think in the positive, this is such an opportunity for Hillel. We probably can predict reasonably well what, for example, traditional Orthodox Judaism will look like in 100 years. We cannot predict what the rest of, pluralistic Jewish existence and observance will look like. We have an incredible opportunity to create that in ways that do inspire our students, that don't overburden our students. And what better place to be, if you want to be part of this, positive and creative Jewish future.
Yeah, I really love that. And I'll just, the only thing I'll add is I think this difficulty is a feature, not a bug of pluralism. And so I think the whole purpose of pluralism is that we have this conversation, not that, oh, yay, we love pluralism, but shoot, we have to have that pesky conversation of how it actually works. I have a couple other, questions, and then if there's anything that we missed, happy to open the floor. One is in regards to non-Ashkenazi students and Mizrahi students. I went to UCLA for undergrad and grad school, where, very quickly I, became absorbed, socially and now romantically into the Persian Jewish community. And my wife is Persian. Basically, all my friends from undergrad were Persian Jews. And so, it's a whole different side of Judaism that even Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews, don't really, understand. And, socially, there's still a barrier. In New York would probably be a similar story with Syrian Jews. And oftentimes, one of the things that I've seen in a lot of liberal Jewish organizations, I won't, name Hillel specifically because I think they sort of all follow down the same relatively comedic, falling, is because of, the dominant way that, liberal American society sees diversity and, quote unquote, people of color, is that the way to grow in terms of, if you want your Shabbat table to be filled with not just Ashkenazi Jews, but also Jews from Morocco and Iran and Syria, is to generally move more open and liberal and, progressive. Whereas, not just data, just anecdotally, I think I know one or two Persian Jews out of hundreds that didn't vote for Trump all three times. And so, I don't say that in order to say, oh my God, Hillel needs to start holding Trump rallies. But I do think, something in the, psychology of the liberal Jewish community tends to be a little bit broken when it comes to, how do we get more, say, Syrian Jews at our events? And I don't have a good solution for this. But, just like I think Hillel spends a lot of time, as it should, thinking about students that fall out to the left of Hillel, of, anti-Zionist students or students that maybe are just enough uncomfortable with Hillel that they wouldn't step in the door. And we spend a lot of time talking about it for a good reason. Of course, our mission is, each and every Jew. On the other side, again, I don't want to, make up data, but I'm sure there's an equally large percentage of Jews who are very conservative, very Republican, and just see Hillel, whether they're right or wrong, as a liberal, progressive / Democrat institution and sort of won't step in because of that. Again, this has been also one of the questions that I've wrestled with, is sort of, half being absorbed in the Persian community and talking to many of, my wife's siblings and cousins and friends and, about their diverse college experiences out there in the world and asking, if they go to Hillel, and oftentimes, I'm sort of packaging their answer into this question. But how might you think about that again from your purview?
Yeah, I'd start with actually the premise. We need to take seriously diversity within the Jewish community, and that includes the very significant presence of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews in North America and around the world. It's, as you know, one of the things that is so misunderstood about Israeli society, where unfortunately people often have this very flat depiction of Israelis as 100% being the folks who either fled or are, the family members of those who fled Ashkenazi Jewish families in Europe. And we know this is not at all the case in terms of the communities that make up Israel today. And we also know that to be the case, as you said. I'm sitting here in New York, very close to multiple of those, Sephardic and Mizrahi-based communities, and you are in Southern California, and there are many in between. So I just start from the simple premise, which is forget political dimensions, just in terms of traditions, in terms of an understanding of the broader Jewish community. It's really important that we have that understanding and sensitivity. I think if you go to the next step of where your question went, this is kind of like the pluralism question in the following sense. It's not easy for us to be a nonpartisan, post-political organization, particularly in 2025. But I think it is also critical. We need to be an environment where whoever you voted for politically, or frankly, whatever your passionate views may be on issues of the day, that there's a space for you to participate in Jewish community and participate and grow through Jewish life. And to your point, I think there are cases where organizations make that really difficult. For example, after a given election, putting out content that broadcasts very clearly that organizationally they have a point of view. We have worked hard at the Hill International level, and I think across the Hill movement to avoid that. As I said, not easy. Not only because the times sometimes feel like they require a statement or a positioning, but also because our students called for it, because our partners on campus called for it, because our donors and alumni called for it. So it just, I think, requires us to be even stronger in defining the fact that Hillel is not about a political point of view or political posture. We are about advancing Jewish life in the ways we've defined and described it, and just trying to stick to those guns.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I'm asking you all the impossible questions that, I've been wrestling with for years. So there's obviously, if there was an answer, I think we probably would have come up with it. It is difficult. And again, it's what, it's filed in that category of things that I personally don't know what to do as somebody oftentimes, working with Tammy, our executive director, to craft a lot of these statements. Do you speak out that you say, and again, I'm not going to make you answer this, but like, is the repeal of Roe an infringement on Jewish values? Well, are you asking me philosophically, me as a Jewish thinker? Are you asking, me as representing students that have a diverse range of perspectives on things like LGBTQ rights and, the big new bill that Trump is signing, right? Those questions get difficult. If Hillel says nothing, we risk becoming irrelevant. If Hillel speaks out on everything, then you risk, continuing to alienate people. There's two more things that I wanted to get your opinion on, and I know our time is short. One is this Franklin Foer article in The Atlantic that everybody's been talking about in the last year. This has been one of my go-to questions asking guests. What do you make of the general thesis that, we have reached an inflection point in America and, obviously life is not terrible for everybody, but there is some golden age that was now over in the last 2 years and, never again will we be in the, the 1990s, where everything seems, laissez-faire and great, even though probably historically that is not how people saw it. But I'm curious what you make of the general thesis.
I love the article. I thought it was helpfully provocative. I don't believe in the thesis at all. And that's for a couple reasons. Number one, as you pointed out, as you were asking the question, the quote golden age is a really, I think, unhelpful nostalgia. There have been opportunities and challenges for Jews and Jewish life in America throughout that entire period. And to, wash over it as if there was a golden age, I think does an injustice to the diversity and complexity of what Jewish life has represented. I also think taking almost like a reverse Hegelian view of the future, that like it's inexorable, that in fact, American life and Jewish life will look in a certain fashion, it is absurd. I mean, we can barely predict what's happening tomorrow when it comes to campus, when it comes to issues involving Israel, when it comes to politics, the economy, everything. So I just don't think that's such a helpful place to focus our attention. Do I worry about the rise of contemporary anti-Semitism in America? Absolutely. Is it real? Beyond a doubt. We've recorded thousands of instances at Hillel just on campus of cases of discrimination, harassment, bullying, marginalization, assault, and the like. So, and that's different than it was. So we can absolutely point to the negative trend. Is it the case that there's major disruption when it comes to environments like where we operate in higher education? Of course. But what will that look like in 5 years? Again, I will stick to my guns as the builder, the optimist, and someone who sees opportunity in this period. We can create an absolutely stronger environment in America for Jewish life. And to do that, we just have to get serious about defining the design of that. What does that look like? What actually would feel stronger, more thriving, and more meaningful, and more inclusive? And then just go do it. We are an incredible group of doers at Hillel, in the American Jewish community, and through global Jewish peoplehood. And I know we're wrapping up, so I'm just going to add a couple quick final points to that. That to me are very Hillel. Not only are we doers at Hillel, we're doers who believe in what helped create the positivity of the American Jewish scene over the last 100 years, which is we believe in not only a thriving Jewish community, we believe in contributing to a positive overall community. In our context, that means on campus, but that means in the broader world as well. And so I think that enables us to continue to enrich not only, as we say in our mission, the Jewish people, but also the broader world. In addition, we believe at Hillel in the power of joy, the power of what it means to unlock a young person's horizon using thousands of years of Jewish wisdom, Jewish tradition, Jewish practice. And we have more opportunity to do that going forward, not less. So, I would welcome the chance to talk to Franklin. I talked to him right when his article came out. He came and spoke to a small group of us, but to revisit the whole premise and figure out how we can be the builders who actually create more of a grand future for not only Jewish people, but all people in our society moving forward.
Yeah, I really like the focus on joy because, all these issues that we're talking about that are sort of the less than ideal, that really is, at least I see it, a very small percentage of what we do. The vast majority of the time, it's people engaging in community and Jewish practice and Jewish learning and, Israeli culture. And that is just, pure unadulterated Jewish joy. Obviously, that wouldn't be as interesting to talk about. So it was funny, when I was talking to some students and I told them that I was going to talk with you, and some of them, helped me formulate some questions. They were like, are you gonna, ask any challenging questions or push back? And I said, yeah, I usually do. And so, they kind of know my iconoclastic nature, because obviously we could spend not just 1 hour, probably the rest of the week, talking about all the great things that we would just be like, yes, and this, and this, and this. But this is a lot more fun. And I think, part of this conversation of the push and pull on things like religious identity and political identity is, again, what makes living and working in a pluralistic community so meaningful. So as I said before, I really do view any and all of this, and including people that are going to think that we were too right-wing and too left-wing and too religious and too not religious and, anything in between. I view that as a feature. And I think our wider community is much stronger because of the ability to have these conversations in a civil way over a Shabbat meal or over, a Parsha and pizza, rather than everybody be in their own silos in, 30 different Jewish communities. Adam, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you, Daniel. Looking forward to doing it again at some point when, as I said, we can talk about how much closer we've gotten to a new golden age of Jewish life at Hillel and in America.
Amen.